Seoul at dusk was a sea of electric blues and artificial pinks, a shimmering facade of progress that hid a darker, more rhythmic pulse beneath its skin. Kang Min-jae moved through this world like a ghost of charcoal and shadow, a man carved from the very silence he commanded. At nearly 40, the head of the Iron Lotus Syndicate had perfected the art of terrifying stillness. He wore a sleek gray suit over a black turtleneck. His dark hair slicked back with a precision that mirrored his icy business dealings. As he stepped out onto the glowing city street, the busy world seemed to stutter in its tracks, the air growing heavy with the weight of his presence. This was his district, and everyone knew the unspoken rules of the King of Neon. When Min-jae walked past the bright shop signs, the ambient chatter of the crowd died a sudden, clinical death. Shop owners didn't just look away. They stepped back into the safety of their doorways, their hands often trembling as they adjusted their open signs. He was a man of quiet, absolute authority, a calculated leader who viewed the city as a grand chessboard where every move was measured and every person was a piece to be utilized or discarded. Under the Iron Lotus banner, order was the only currency that mattered. Min-jae had spent years building a reputation based on two pillars: absolute loyalty and a complete, surgical emotional detachment. In the underworld of Seoul, he was the shadow that kept the peace. A man who preferred a quiet meeting in a dim backroom to a loud war in the streets. His rule was built on the premise that fear was a tool, but respect was a fortress. In his world, children were complications, and emotions were the cracks in the armor that could bring an entire empire to its knees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised violet, Min-jae adjusted his silver cuffs. He had just finished a high-stakes meeting where millions were shifted with a single, imperceptible nod of his head. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His presence alone was a pressure that weighed on the narrow alleys and crowded thoroughfares. He was the monster that kept the other monsters in line, the man who held the keys to the city's dark heart. To the public, he was a ghost story whispered over drinks. To the police, he was a mountain they couldn't climb. He moved toward his waiting black sedan, his mind already calculating the next day's logistics, oblivious to the fact that his rigid world was about to collide with a variable he could never have predicted. He had survived decades by trusting his instincts and keeping his heart under lock and key, unaware that the most expensive contract of his life was currently being held by a small girl with teary eyes and a $5 bill. The polished leather of his shoes hit the wet pavement, a sound that usually signaled the end of the day's business. But as he reached for the car door, the predictable silence of the evening was broken not by a gunshot or a siren, but by the soft, desperate tapping of a hand that didn't know enough to be afraid. The pastel stripes of Lily Sunday's cardigan felt like a faded rainbow against the heavy, suffocating silence of the empty apartment. She sat on the floor, her jeans worn thin at the knees, watching the neon signs of the Seoul streets flicker through the window in rhythmic pulses of electric blue and artificial pink. Her mother, Sarah Bush, had been gone for 3 days, and the world had never felt so large or so cold. Lily still remembered the night it happened, the way the shadows had elongated when the men from the Viper crew forced their way inside. They had spoken of rent and debts that Sarah couldn't pay, their voices sharp and jagged like broken glass, before they dragged her mother into the dark. Lily had tried to be brave, just as her mother had always taught her. On the first morning, she had walked to the local police precinct, her small hands lost in the sleeves of her oversized cardigan. She had stood before the towering desks and the officers in their crisp, intimidating uniforms, her voice trembling as she begged for help. But the police had failed her. They looked at her with eyes that saw only a nuisance, not an emergency. They were either too buried in their own bureaucracy or too quietly terrified of the Viper mark to intervene in a debt dispute. They told her to go home and wait for a social worker, leaving a 7-year-old girl to survive on dry crackers and the dwindling hope that the door might finally open. By the third evening, that hope was beginning to fray at the edges. Lily realized that the people who were supposed to be the good guys weren't coming. She remembered the stories her mother had whispered during their long walks through the district, stories of the grand shadow, Kang Min-jae. Sarah had described him as a monster with a code, a man so powerful that even the city's highest officials looked the other way when his shadow fell upon the pavement. Her mother had said he was the only person in Seoul who never broke a promise, mostly because he was the only one who didn't fear the consequences of keeping it. Lily reached into her pocket and touched the crumpled $5 bill she had saved from months of small chores. It was all she had in the world. A thin piece of paper that felt like her only shield. She knew she couldn't go back to the station. She needed someone who lived in the dark. Someone who understood the language of the men who took her mother. She stepped out into the glowing city street at dusk. The bright shop signs blurring as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She navigated the crowded thoroughfares, looking for the specific black sedan and the sea of silence that followed the king of neon. She was small, and her face was trembling with a terrifying mix of fear and resolve. But she stood her ground near the entrance of the district's most exclusive lounge. She waited for the sleek gray suit and the black turtleneck that signaled the arrival of the Grand Shadow. She was ready to hire the only monster capable of bringing her mother home. The black sedan purred at the curb, a silent predator waiting for its master. Kong Min-jae reached for the door handle, his mind already drifting toward the night's ledgers. When he felt it, a soft, hesitant tug on the sleeve of his gray suit. It was a sensation so foreign, so entirely outside the rules of his existence, that he stopped dead. His enforcers moved like a single lethal machine, their hands disappearing into their jackets, eyes scanning for a threat. But as they looked down, the tension in the air shattered into a confused, heavy silence. Min-jae turned slowly. He expected a desperate debtor or a bold assassin. Instead, he found himself looking into the tear-rimmed eyes of a girl who barely reached his waist. Lily Sunday stood there, her pastel cardigan a jarring splash of innocence against the grim concrete. Her hands were shaking, but her grip on a crumpled $5 bill was white-knuckled and absolute. "What is this?" Min-jae asked. His voice was the low, dangerous hum that usually made grown men beg for mercy. But the girl didn't flinch. "I want to hire you," Lily whispered, her voice cracking but holding a strange, rhythmic strength. She thrust the money toward him, the paper soft and worn from days of being clutched in a dark apartment. "My mom said you're the only monster who keeps his word. Please, I need to hire a monster." Min-jae froze. The term monster wasn't new to him. He had heard it hissed in back alleys and spat by rivals in their final moments, but coming from a child, it carried a weight that made his chest tighten. He looked at his men, whose widened eyes reflected his own shock. For the first time in 15 years, the King of Neon was caught off guard. He slowly crouched down, his black turtleneck framing a face that had suddenly lost its mask of detached calculation. "Who is your mother, kid?" he asked, his tone dropping from an icy command to a quiet, intense focus. "Sarah Bush," Lily sobbed, the dam finally breaking as the words poured out of her. She spoke of the 3 nights spent in the dark, of the Viper men who had kicked in their door, and the smell of their cheap cigarettes. She told him about the police who looked at the floor when she mentioned the Vipers, and the way the neighborhood had turned its back on a single mother who had no one left to protect her. "They said if I told anyone, she wouldn't come home. But you're not anyone. You're the Grand Shadow." Image, a high-angle shot of Min-jae kneeling before Lily on the neon-lit sidewalk. The $5 bill held between them like a sacred relic. Min-jae stared at the $5 bill. It was a pittance, a joke compared to the millions he had moved earlier that hour. But as he looked at Lily's trembling lip and the bravery in her stance, he realized this wasn't a transaction. It was a contract of blood and honor. The Vipers had brought a low, cowardly kind of evil into his territory, believing the Grand Shadow was too busy counting gold to notice the screams of the poor. He didn't take the money. Instead, he reached out and gently closed Lily's small fingers back over the bill. "Keep your money, Lily," he said, his eyes turning into shards of cold, dark glass as he stood back up to his full, imposing height. He turned to his lead enforcer, his voice returning to the terrifying, clinical tone that signaled the start of a hunt. "Find out where the Vipers are nesting. Bring the Iron Lotus. Every single one of them." The street felt colder as Min-jae looked back at the girl one last time. He had been hired, and the price of his intervention was going to be far higher than $5. The Vipers were about to learn that there was only one monster allowed in these streets, and they had just invited him to dinner. Min-jae stood up slowly, the movement fluid and predatory, but his mind was a fractured landscape of conflicting protocols. Behind him, the idling engine of the black sedan was a low, mechanical growl that usually signaled the end of his day, the transition from public face to private power. But the touch of Lily's small, shaking fingers on his sleeve had left a searing heat that even the cold Seoul night could not extinguish. He was a man who lived by a rigorous, unyielding set of rules, the code of the Iron Lotus, which dictated that a leader must be a stone wall, impervious to the tides of sentiment and the messy, unpredictable variables of the street. "Boss," his lead enforcer whispered, a silent question hanging in the air. The men were confused. They were waiting for the dismissal, the cold brush-off, or the sharp order to remove the child from their path. Instead, they watched as their leader stared down at the scuffed, light-up sneakers of a 7-year-old girl. Inside, Min-jae was at war. He had spent 15 years perfecting a version of himself that was more machine than man. To the syndicate, he was a genius of logistics and intimidation. To the city, he was an untouchable ghost. He had a rule for everything: never touch the business of others, never engage with the police, and above all, never, ever let a personal feeling dictate a strategic move. Getting involved with a missing woman over a $5 plea was not just bad business. It was an act of tactical insanity. It would draw unwanted eyes, stir up the volatile vipers, and break the carefully maintained isolation that kept the Iron Lotus safe. But the word Lily had used, monster, vibrated in his chest like a struck bell. He had always known he was a monster. He had accepted the darkness as the price of his throne. Yet, the girl hadn't used the word as an insult. She had used it as a prayer. She wasn't looking for a hero. She was looking for someone who could descend into the pit where her mother had been taken and drag her back out. Someone whose darkness was greater than the men who had stolen her light. If he turned away now, he would remain the efficient CEO of a criminal empire. But he would lose the one thing that separated the Iron Lotus from the scavengers like the Viper crew: his word. Sarah Bush had told her daughter that Min-jae was a monster who kept his word. It was a reputation he hadn't realized he had among the nobodies of his district. He realized that if he failed this child, his power was a hollow shell, a kingdom built on fear, but devoid of the honor that made fear respectable. He looked at the neon-lit street, seeing the faces of the shopkeepers who were watching from the shadows. They were waiting to see if their king was merely a tyrant or a protector. The conflict within him reached a snapping point. The monster wasn't a label he needed to fear. It was his true nature, and for the first time in his life, he saw a way to use that nature for something other than profit. Rule number 1, Min-jae said, his voice returning to that terrifying, clinical clarity that made the air around him feel thin. Protect the territory. And anyone who takes a mother from my streets is a parasite on my territory. He didn't look back at the girl, but his posture had shifted from a man departing to a commander preparing for an invasion. He had accepted the contract. He would be the monster she hired. And God help anyone who stood in his way. The black sedan didn't move toward the luxury high-rises of Gangnam. Instead, it cut a silent, predatory path through the jagged, narrow veins of the district. Inside the car, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the cold, vibrating fury radiating from Kang Min-jae. He had spent 15 years perfecting a kingdom of order, yet within minutes of Lily's plea, his intelligence network began to reveal a rot he had failed to notice from his high perch. Phone calls were made in low, lethal tones, and the Iron Lotus Syndicate went into motion, not for a bank heist or a territory expansion, but to find a ghost. By the time the car reached a nondescript office in the back of a bustling night market, his lead enforcers were already waiting with tablets and maps. The reports coming back chilled even the hardened men who sat in the front seat. The Viper crew wasn't just collecting rent from struggling families. They were running a shadow operation that violated the most sacred boundary of the Iron Lotus. They were preying on the vulnerable, immigrants and single mothers like Sarah Bush, and moving them through the district like untraceable cargo. Min-jae stared at the digital screen, his jaw tight as he realized his own detached efficiency had provided the Vipers with the perfect cover. Because he had focused only on the high-level movements of gold and influence, he had missed the vermin nesting in the foundations. The Vipers had been utilizing abandoned basements and the shipping yards where the neon lights didn't reach to run a human trafficking ring. They were taking people from his streets and preparing to ship them out of the country as if they were nothing more than merchandise. They thought we wouldn't care, his enforcer muttered, pointing to a series of grainy surveillance photos showing a white van with no plates. They thought a few missing foreigners and laborers wouldn't be worth the king's time. Min-jae's eyes turned into shards of obsidian. To him, this wasn't just a crime, it was a personal insult. His code was built on the idea that the neighborhood paid for protection, and in return, he kept the chaos at bay. By allowing the Vipers to treat his people like livestock, he had become a landlord of a graveyard. The Vipers believed he was a businessman who only cared about the bottom line. But they were about to learn that the monster had a very specific set of limits. The investigation moved with a surgical, terrifying speed. They tracked the white van to an industrial shipyard on the edge of the city, a place of rusted steel and deep water. Min-jae watched as his men checked their weapons. The rhythmic metallic clicks echoing in the small room. There was no discussion of profit or ransoms. This was a cleansing. The Vipers had brought a dishonorable sickness into his home, and they had underestimated the weight of a child's $5 contract. As the rain began to patter against the windows, a heavy, dark omen of the night to come, Min-jae adjusted his gray suit jacket. He felt the $5 bill in his pocket, a small, crumpled reminder of the girl in the pastel cardigan. He wasn't just going to find Sarah Bush. He was going to burn the Viper crew out of his city until not even their shadows remained. The hunt was no longer about logic. It was about the soul of the Iron Lotus. The midnight sky over Seoul's industrial periphery didn't just rain. It wept a heavy, freezing deluge that turned the shipyard into a labyrinth of slick steel and blurred shadows. The downpour washed away the neon warmth of the upper city, leaving only the harsh, flickering amber of sodium security lights reflected in oil-slicked puddles. Kang Min-jae stood at the edge of the pier, his gray suit darkening under the onslaught. Yet he remained as immovable as a monument of granite. He didn't look like a man about to start a war. He looked like a surgeon standing over an infected limb, ready to make the first incision. Behind him, the Iron Lotus enforcers moved with a silent, lethal grace that the Vipers could never hope to mimic. There were no shouted orders or chaotic surges. They were a tide of black tactical gear and silenced muzzles, melting into the darkness of rusted shipping containers. The Vipers, arrogant in their belief that they were beneath the king's notice, had left their sentries exposed. One by one, the lookouts were neutralized, not with the loud brutality of street thugs, but with the terrifying efficiency of a professional shadow. The assault began in earnest when a flash of lightning illuminated the central warehouse, a cavernous, groaning structure that smelled of damp concrete and desperate fear. Min-jae led from the front, his polished shoes stepping over the debris of a broken gate. As the thunder rolled, masking the sound of breaching charges, the warehouse doors buckled. The interior was a grim contrast to Min-jae's polished world, rows of makeshift holding cells and crates marked for export, surrounded by Viper soldiers who were laughing over cards and cheap liquor. When the Iron Lotus stepped into the light, the laughter died a sudden, violent death. The Vipers scrambled for their weapons, but they were fighting a ghost they couldn't touch. Min-jae moved through the crossfire with a mask of terrifying calm, his movements fluid and unwavering. He wasn't just here to rescue a woman. He was here to reclaim the honor of his streets. Every shot fired by his men was a calculated answer to the chaos the Vipers had invited into the district. In the center of the chaos, tied to a rusted chair beneath a single, swinging light bulb, sat Sarah Bush. Her eyes were wide with a terror that only intensified as the men who had snatched her were systematically erased from the room. Min-jae locked eyes with her for a fleeting second, a silent, jagged promise passing between the monster and the mother. He didn't slow down. He stepped over the fallen without a glance, his gaze fixed on the back office where the Viper leadership was surely hiding. The air was thick with the scent of spent gunpowder and wet metal, the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the corrugated roof sounding like 1,000 ticking clocks. The Vipers had thought they could operate in the shadows of the Iron Lotus, but they had forgotten that Min-jae was the shadow. As the last of the warehouse defenders fell, Min-jae reached the heavy steel door of the inner sanctum. He adjusted his damp cuffs, the $5 bill in his pocket a hidden weight of iron. The siege was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The warehouse fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the metal roof and the ragged breathing of the men still left alive. In the center of the room, surrounded by the cold, shimmering steel of shipping containers, stood the leader of the Viper crew, a man named Park, whose face was a mask of sweat and desperate greed. As Min-jae stepped into the light, his gray suit soaked through, but his expression as sharp as a razor, Park didn't reach for his gun. He knew better. Instead, he kicked a heavy, silver briefcase across the wet concrete. The latch broke on impact, spilling stacks of high-denomination bills and the heavy, dull gleam of gold bars into the puddles. "Min-jae," "Stop," Park stammered, his hands held up in a pleading gesture. "This is 5 million. Just for tonight's silence. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what we can make together. Why throw away a partnership over a few nobodies? We can split the district 60/40ths. Think of the profit. Think of the logic." Min-jae didn't even glance at the wealth at his feet. His polished shoes stepped over the stacks of currency as if they were nothing more than discarded trash. He stopped inches from Park, his presence so overwhelming that the smaller man seemed to shrink. The Iron Lotus leader looked down at the briefcase, then back at Sarah, who was being untied by his enforcers in the shadows. "You think I'm here for a bigger cut?" Min-jae's voice was a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to strike directly at the bone. "You think my silence is a commodity you can buy with the very paper I print in my sleep?" Park's eyes darted toward the exit, his confidence evaporating. "It's just business. Min-jae, the woman is a ghost, a foreigner with no backing. Why risk a war with our suppliers over a single mother? It makes no sense. Where's the profit in this?" "The profit," Min-jae said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream, "is that I finally know exactly what my word is worth." He reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out the crumpled $5 bill Lily had given him. He held it up between two fingers, the humble, worn paper contrasting sharply with the expensive gray silk of his sleeve. "I have already been paid, Park. I took a contract from a 7-year-old girl who believes I am a man of my word. And unlike you, I find her currency far more valuable than yours." Image. A close-up of Min-jae's hand holding the crumpled $5 bill, with the spilled millions in the blurred background. Park stared at the $5 bill, his face pale with a sudden, dawning realization. He had tried to bribe a man who had found something he hadn't felt in decades, a sense of duty. Min-jae didn't need to give an order. He simply looked at his lead enforcer and gave a single, microscopic nod. He turned his back on the money and the man, walking toward Sarah Bush with the grace of a king leaving a battlefield. As he helped Sarah to her feet, her eyes wide with shock and relief. The briefcase remained on the wet concrete, ignored and irrelevant. The Vipers had tried to buy the Grand Shadow, but they had failed to realize that some things, like the hope of a child and the honor of a monster, were simply not for sale. The price of Min-jae's silence was a debt the Vipers could never afford to pay, and as he led Sarah toward the exit, the sound of the rain swallowed the last of Park's pleas. The storm had retreated to a hollow drizzle by the time the black sedan pulled back onto the familiar street corner where the neon signs of the district fought against the approaching dawn. The electric blues and artificial pinks of the city were reflected in the puddles on the pavement, creating a fractured, glowing world that felt entirely different from the one they had left hours ago. Sarah Bush sat in the back seat, her hands still trembling slightly, though they were now wrapped in the warmth of a clean wool blanket provided by one of Min-jae's men. She leaned against the window, her heart hammering against her ribs as she saw a small, familiar figure sitting on a plastic crate outside the corner store. Lily hadn't moved. Despite the rain, despite the cold, and despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull her small frame into sleep, the girl in the pastel cardigan had kept her vigil. She sat under the store's awning, her eyes fixed on the exact spot where the Grand Shadow had vanished into the night. When the car slowed to a halt and the door clicked open, Lily didn't just stand, she flew. "Mama!" The cry was raw, a sound of pure, unfiltered relief that pierced through the early morning hum of the waking city. Sarah scrambled out of the car, her knees nearly giving way as she dropped to the wet concrete. Lily launched herself into her mother's arms, her small hands clutching Sarah's coat as if she were trying to stitch their two lives back together. They collapsed into a huddle of tears and whispered names. The nightmare of the last 3 days finally dissolving under the warm glow of the shop signs. Sarah buried her face in Lily's hair, breathing in the scent of home, of soap and the faint sweetness of the crackers the girl had survived on while waiting alone. Standing a few feet away, Kang Min-jae watched them. He stood with his hands folded behind his back, the sleek gray of his suit marked by the dampness of the shipyard, yet he remained as poised as a statue. The neighborhood was beginning to stir, but the people who saw him didn't turn away in fear this time. There was a different kind of silence now, a heavy, respectful realization. The monster had returned what was stolen, and he had done it for no reason the underworld could understand. Min-jae stepped forward, his shadow falling over the pair. Sarah looked up, her face wet with tears, her expression a mixture of profound gratitude and lingering awe. She started to speak. Perhaps to offer the thanks she couldn't find words for in the warehouse, but Min-jae simply reached into the pocket of his black turtleneck. He pulled out the $5 bill, still crumpled and soft from Lily's grip. Without a word, he knelt, not with the calculated distance of a king, but with the quiet respect of a man who had seen true bravery in a child's eyes. He placed the bill into Lily's hand, closing her small fingers over the paper. "The contract is closed," he said, his voice a low, steady hum that carried the weight of a solemn oath. "The vipers will not return to this street. Your mother is home because you were brave enough to hire the right man." Lily looked at the money, then up at the man her mother had called a monster. She didn't see a shadow or a ghost. She saw the person who had kept his word when the rest of the world had looked away. "Thank you, Mr. Min-jae," she whispered, her voice finally finding its peace. He gave a sharp, nearly imperceptible nod and stood back up to his full, imposing height. He didn't wait for a formal goodbye or a public display of gratitude. As he stepped back toward the sedan, the monster with a code disappeared into the dark interior of the car. The contract hadn't just saved a mother. It had recalibrated the soul of the man who ruled the neon streets. As the car pulled away into the morning mist, Sarah and Lily stood together on the corner, two small lights in a city that finally felt like it belonged to them again. The seasons in Seoul shifted with their usual indifference, moving from the humid, heavy rains of summer to the sharp, bone-deep chill of a winter that turned the Han River into a jagged sheet of silver. But the rhythm of the East Side had changed in a way that couldn't be measured by the weather or the rising cost of luxury real estate. The neon signs still flickered in electric blues and artificial pinks, and the shopkeepers still spoke in hushed tones when the black sedan rolled down the boulevard. But the fear that once acted as a suffocating shroud had been replaced by a quiet, collective breath of relief. Kang Min-jae remained the king of neon, but he was no longer just a ghost who moved pieces on a board. He had become the silent pillar of the district. Inside his private office, overlooking the sprawling tapestry of the city, Min-jae sat behind a desk of polished obsidian. On the wall behind him, where most men of his stature would display degrees of conquest or framed photographs with powerful politicians, there was a small, simple frame. Inside it sat a drawing Lily had sent him months after the shipyard raid. A stick-figure man in a gray suit standing between a little girl and a black snake. It was crude and colorful, a stark contrast to the cold, expensive minimalist decor of the room. Min-jae reached into the pocket of his black turtleneck and pulled out a small object. It wasn't a burner phone or a weapon, but the original $5 bill. It was worn almost to the point of tearing. The ink faded from the countless times he had rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger while making difficult decisions. It had become his new moral compass, a physical reminder of the night he realized that power without a purpose was merely a slow death. Whenever a lieutenant suggested a lucrative deal that preyed on the weak, or a rival syndicate offered a truce built on the suffering of the neighborhood, Min-jae would feel the texture of that crumpled bill. He had dismantled the Viper crew and absorbed their territory, not to expand his criminal empire, but to ensure that no other parasites could ever set up shop in his shadows. He had turned his enforcers into a different kind of elite crew, men who understood that their primary duty was to maintain the peace that a 7-year-old girl had bought with her life savings. In the evenings, Min-jae would sometimes have his driver take the long route, passing by the small apartment complex where Sarah and Lily lived. He never stopped, and he never made his presence known, but he watched from behind the tinted glass as the girl in the pastel cardigan walked home from school. Sarah worked at a local cultural center now, a position Min-jae had quietly secured through a series of untraceable shell companies, ensuring they would never have to worry about rent or debt ever again. He saw Lily pause at the corner store, the very spot where she had once knelt in the rain to hire a monster. She looked happy, her face no longer trembling with the weight of the world, but bright with the simple, uncomplicated joy of a child who knew she was safe. Min-jae realized then that the $5 hadn't just saved Sarah Bush, it had saved him. It had given his city a soul, and given a cold man a reason to keep his word. The king of neon put the bill back into his pocket, close to his heart, and looked out at the lights of Seoul. The monster with a code was still there, lurking in the shadows to keep the darkness at bay. But for the first time in 15 years, Kang Min-jae wasn't alone. He was the guardian of a $5 contract, and as long as he drew breath, the district would never be cold again.